Hank Klibanoff is co-author, along with Gene Roberts, of The Race Beat, The Press, The Civil Rights Struggle, and the Awakening of a Nation. We had hoped that Gene Roberts, formerly with both the New York Times and Philadelphia Inquirer in top editor jobs, might make a hasty recovery from recent surgery and be able to be with us tonight, but he is not quite ready to travel yet. So Mr. Klibanoff is going solo for tonight's discussion. We are grateful that he is willing and has guts. The Race Beat has been called meticulously researched and vividly rendered. Here are just a few glowing notices. This one from David Halberstam. Roberts and Klibanoff have succeeded in telling the dramatic story of the extraordinary courage of great reporters like Bill Miner, Claude Sitting, John Herbers, and Carl Fleming, war correspondents on native soil during one of American journalism's finest hours. This is from the Pulitzer Prize winner for his coverage of the Selma civil rights crisis, Haynes Johnson. He says, "A great book, and it could not be more timely. Gene Roberts and Hank Klibanoff remind us of one of the proudest moments in our history, the way the U.S. press rose to its challenge in covering the civil rights movement that led to the ending of the shameful, segregated society of our recent past. A wise and powerful rendering of an epic achievement, one that, as Roberts and Klibanoff eloquently write, awakened the nation and summoned the best in the American character to right wrongs and uphold the proudest principles of our democracy." And from one of my idols, Jonathan Yardley, in the Washington Post book world, "Reading this history takes me back to my youth in vivid and intensely personal ways. It was at once one of the most terrible times in the nation's history and one of the most enthralling. The stories of these men are essential to the history of the civil rights movement." And the Baltimore Sun said, "A work that is certain to make its place on the top shelf of books about the civil rights movement." We have some important journalists with us tonight who are at the center of this story, and I will let Mr. Klibanoff fold them into the program and introduce them to you. I'm hoping they will also take part in our Q&A session. Hank Klibanoff is a native of Alabama, a reporter in Mississippi for 6 years, and did a stint at the Boston Globe. He was a longtime reporter and editor with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and that's where he met Gene Roberts. For the past 4 years, he has been managing editor at the AJC. He lives in Atlanta with his wife Lori, who's with us tonight, his daughter Eleanor, and 2 other daughters. Forgot to get their names. A warm welcome, please, for Hank Klibanoff.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you all for coming out. It's a cold, bitter night. Well, by Atlanta standards, a cold, bitter night, and I'm honored to be with you tonight. And I see so many people from so many different parts of my life, and my present, my past. Even have an old high school buddy here. That's great. And so many wonderful people that I work with at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. I'm probably going to do a couple of things that some of you may have heard before, but I do want to say that it's nice to know that you're going to be speaking publicly and to be able to prepare. I've had the occasion of being called on unexpectedly. It happened in 1984 during Super Tuesday. And I was a reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I was sent back to my home state of Alabama to cover Reverend Jesse Jackson's campaign during the Democratic primary. And as you know, those of you who are longtime Southerners and those of you who are recent arrivals, it was quite a big deal in Alabama to have an African American even considered to be on the ballot in the Democratic primary. And so I went for the cliche story that was certainly a cliche up in the North, but it hadn't really played out in the South, and that is that you go into the African American churches on a Sunday before a Tuesday election, and you listen to the preachers get out the vote for the candidates. Well, it happened all the time in Philadelphia to where we didn't cover it anymore. But it was a news story by Alabama standards, so I signed up to go into a church and pulled into the driveway, and I was met at the parking lot by a couple of the deacons, and they introduced me to the pastor, who said, I had called him the day before to set this all up. He said, I know what you're looking for, and I want to give you what you want. The problem is 5% of the African-American pastors in Alabama are actually with Walter Mondale, and I'm the head of that organization. So I'm not going to give you too much of what you want. He says, however, Reverend Griffin over at the Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, I know you've spoken with him. You head right on over there because he's going to give you what you want. So I showed up to Pilgrim Rest Baptist Church, beautiful little stucco church under the loblolly pines, and walked in there and sat in the back row and got a nod from him, and a couple of kids come up to me and get my business card, and they take it up to him so he can so he can tell people that there's a reporter there at the appropriate time. And Philadelphia, of course, is on Eastern time, and I was in Central time, and it's getting into the afternoon, and I'm beginning to worry about my deadline, and the pastor still hasn't said a word about Reverend Jackson. And he'd start to build up to, it's going to be a historic occasion come Tuesday. It's going to be, and we're going to have some words to say about that, but first we have to have a song. And of course, then we'd have a song, and then he'd start to build up again, then he'd have a song. And this is going on and on. I keep looking at my watch. They're waiting for the story in Philadelphia. Will I ever get it? Finally, he says, ladies and gentlemen, it's going to be a historic Tuesday, and this is our opportunity. He says, I'm just very happy to tell you that we have here today a young man who's come all the way from Philadelphia. A man who's with Hank, his name's Hank Kavanaugh. Somehow I've become Irish, Hank Kavanaugh, who is a reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer. But he's come down here today on behalf of Reverend Jackson's Rainbow Coalition to speak to you about this historic moment in history. And I looked around, and the same two kids are back, and this time they're not taking my business card up to the front, they're taking me up to the front. And so as I'm walking down the aisle, to go speak, I see that they keep lowering the mic to figure out how short is this guy anyway, And I went to the pastor and and he's up there, and I said, and he bent down to talk to me, and I said, there must be some mistake. And he looked at me like, there may be, but you're going to cover it. So I said, gotcha, and I turned around and gave a little talk, how happy I was to be back in Alabama, that I was from Alabama, put on a little my Bear Bryant, that I was from over to Florence, and that it was going to be a historic occasion. Of course, I didn't have a dog in the fight. I wasn't able to, as a journalist, express my opinion one way or the other, except to say that it was historic. There's no doubt historic. Things were about to happen. The mere fact that Reverend Jackson was on the ballot, and thank you very much. I've missed my deadline. I have to go, So, and I started to leave. There wasn't much else to do, and as I'm leaving in the parking lot, I run across this woman who's racing into the church with her little child. They're clearly running late, and she's worried that they've missed something, I could have told them they hadn't missed anything yet. And I stopped her and introduced myself and nailed the quote that I needed, and the pastor had said enough things about the historic moment that I was able to get a story out of it. I think we were desperate enough that day in Philadelphia, we put it on page 1. But anyway, this occasion I knew was coming, and I am just as ill prepared as I was then. I do want to talk about a few things tonight, and take the opportunity to introduce you to some people who played such an important part, and not just the development of the book. That's insignificant compared to what they really did in history, and that was served as just reporters of enormous courage and bravery and good sense in the during the coverage of the civil rights movement. The first thing I want to do, I'm so glad that Julie introduced my wife and my daughter who are here. My two other daughters are, one had an open mic contest tonight, and the other is at, is it Rock Eagle? I forget, one of these. So I'm sorry that they're not here, but I owe them so much, and particularly my wife, Laurie. She has suffered through this thing for 10 or 12 years, and my co-author, Gene Roberts, who I'm even sorrier cannot be here, was working on this for about 3 years before then, and took us a long time. I hope those of you who have parted with your money find that it was worthwhile. But I just owe you everything for that. And I do want to say that this does not happen without great support of friends, and especially I want to say my colleagues at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They're the ones who stop at my desk when I'm suddenly feeling frazzled because I'm on deadline for the book, and I have other deadlines, and snap at them, and they always, take it, and I appreciate it. But y'all are a great staff and great fun to work with, and I appreciate it. The race beat begins in the 1930s. The race beat begins with an incredible man who I was so happy to learn more about in the research of this book. And even though some of you may have heard this before, I do want to spend a little time on this. Back in 1938, the Carnegie Foundation looked across this country and said, we have a serious problem with race relations in America, most particularly in the South. And we need to understand what that's all about. It is defining this nation and dividing this nation. And we need to find out what it's all about. They wanted to hire someone to run the study, this examination from outside America, someone who sort of didn't come in with a natural bias. And so they hired Gunnar Myrdal, Swedish economist, a man of great renown in Sweden, less so over here, and they set him free. They gave him a staff of 125 researchers. Many of them were far more distinguished in this country social scientists than he was. And they paired him up with Ralph Bunche, who was already a distinguished intellect, in addition to having been an All-American football player, a man of some great savvy. And they came into the South, and they studied race relations in the South for 6 years. In the interim, as war is breaking out all across Europe, and as Hitler is marching into nations, Myrdal and his wife Alva got very alarmed that Sweden would be next, their homeland. And so they go back to Sweden for a period of time to try to, what are they going to do? Protect Sweden against Hitler? They didn't know what they were going to do. But they get there and they are instantly shocked to see that what they thought would be the first line of protest against the march of Hitler, the newspapers had basically collapsed. They just gave up. They weren't exactly collaborationists, but they were not going to fight this thing. And it crystallized at that moment something that was brewing in Myrdal's head. That one thing that would certainly distinguish America and the South was the free press. And he was developing a theme right then, and he developed it even further, that a free press was a manifestation of a country that at its heart was good. America, he decided, was a great, great nation built on valuable principles, pure principles, that the American people at their heart believe in fair play, they believe in justice, but they don't always act that way. And quite often they have leaders who will lead them astray and who will confuse them and who will mess up their minds. But if they're left to their own devices, they will stand up for what's right and they will try to do the right thing. And that the press had an enormous part to play in this. At the time, he said, the only press in the South is your Southern press, which is fundamentally segregationist with a few progressive voices, and the black press. Now, the black press that existed in the South were papers such as the Pittsburgh Courier coming down into the South, the Baltimore Afro-American, the Norfolk Journal and Guide, though they were a little conservative by comparison, the Chicago Defender, and they were circulating widely in the South with total impunity. White segregationists allowed these newspapers to say the most awful things about white segregationists because they weren't reading it and they didn't care. And it occurred to Murdahl, well, this is not the press that's going to expose the inhumanity of Jim Crow in the South. And it will not be the black press. The liberal white press, there are too few voices to expose it. Whoever exposes the degradation and the abuse of African Americans in the South, he decided, would have a natural audience in the North. But there was no one here doing it. He said, when the Northern press comes in, if they ever come in, that's going to make all the difference in the world. Because Northerners, while they would prefer to ignore what's going on there, if their noses are rubbed in it, they won't be able to. And they will be, as he said, shocked and shaken by what they see and what they read. And so as this story unfolds, in fact, he says, I want to tell you that Murdahl's work was produced in a book called An American Dilemma. It's 1,483 pages. It's even bigger than mine, okay? 1,483 pages, and that was reduced from tens of thousands of pages and monographs. By page 50, it's actually page 48, Murdahl has already reached the conclusion that is the core of this book. And he put it in italics. To get publicity is of the highest strategic importance to the American Negro. Publicity meaning attention. And as this book tells, and as it unfolds, you see how this occurred. First the black press, the liberal whites who were few, and then Northern press, Northern institutions coming into the South to tell the story. That came out in 1944, The American Dilemma. 3 years later, the New York Times created its Southern Bureau. They put a bureau in Chattanooga, where the Ox family lived that owned the New York Times. And they put a wonderful, a delightful man there named Johnny Popham, John Popham, a Tidewater Virginian, dapper fellow. There are people here who can do his accent better than I. And he was he knew everybody in the South, and everybody knew him. I think the stories were he could go to just about any county in the South and would find someone he was related to. Okay? And but Johnny had a unique way of covering the South. And I called him Johnny, not out of disrespect. You either called him Johnny or Pop, okay? And he had a unique way of covering the South. He drove everywhere. He wouldn't fly. And he had a view of the South that was very favorable, very positive. The truth of the matter is that he did not see the extremes. And if you didn't see the extremes, you didn't see the story. He didn't believe, over time, he did not believe that the white people, the segregationists, were going to resist as strongly as they did, or that the black people were going to push as hard as they did. And he didn't want to believe it. And he wrote long letters to the then managing editor, which was the top person at the New York Times, Turner Catledge, another Southerner, trying to describe how he was approaching the South. And basically said, to really get to know the South, you have to drive from town to town. And you got to stop at the university, to the college towns. And you got to stop and you talk to the college president. You find what's on their minds, and you find out what's in their hearts. And that's how you learn the soul of the South. Wrong. He got a misguided view of what was going on. And I will tell you that it was somewhat painful to reach this conclusion. It was painful because there are people, and you're going to meet them, here. There were people here who knew him well. There were people here, he had a pretty good reputation. But the truth emerged from all the readings and all the writings that for 10 years, essentially, the New York Times missed the story. Now, I was in a radio interview the other day, and the guy interviewing me says, so basically the New York Times takes a shellacking in your book. I said, no, but you're on radio, you don't want to contradict the host, not, but the fact is that for 10 years, from 1947 to 1957, he missed the story. So that you get to Little Rock in 1957. Johnny Popham was a great ambassador for the New York Times, by the way. He got to the Emmett Till trial in 1955, and he was largely responsible for the black reporters being able to sit downstairs at a table in the courtroom, not too far from the table where the white reporters were. He sort of knew how to negotiate those things. He gets to Little Rock in 1957, and the New York Times actually is sent down as their top reporter on this story, Benjamin Fine, who was their education editor, they called him, but he was a writing editor. And Benjamin Fine, too, had decided that Little Rock was going to go fine. Central High was going to integrate smoothly. That had been the soundings they'd gotten from Johnny Popham. Those were the soundings they get from Benjamin Fine. And as we now know, Little Rock turned out to be an awful mess. And it turned into a street fight and huge mobs coming out every day trying to stop the 9 students and succeeding in stopping the 9 students from getting in. And the New York Times reporter Benjamin Fine was getting into arguments with everybody. He couldn't take the taunting. They'd call him Jew boy and this, that, and the other, and he couldn't take it. He'd get in arguments with people. And the roles and definitions of what was proper for reporters to do in these situations was being defined right there on the spot. And I have to say that because television was so new, it was being defined live on television. So that you had a situation where, if you recall, the 9 students at Little Rock are planning to go to the school. They pick one way to go. There is one girl who does not get the message, Elizabeth Eckford, the young African-American girl who, as you've seen the photographs of her, walking alone through this mob of white people, and the whites are yelling and screaming at her. It's because she had gotten detached from the larger group. Well, she sits down on a park bench, and the New York Times reporter, Benjamin Fine, goes over and very humanely puts his arm around her and very humanely says, don't let them see you cry. But he crossed the line. He crossed the line for a journalist. There was a television reporter there, Robert Shackney, whose cameraman missed a moment when the mob was, holding up rebel flags or yelling whatever they were yelling. And so he asked the crowd to reenact that. Television was new. Among the people who was there and in Little Rock at the time, and I'd like to introduce him, Ralph Patrick. He was a reporter with the Arkansas Democrat. Ralph, would you say hello to everybody here? I got to meet Ralph when I came here to the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He was working there, and he has retired, but every chance we can get him back, we do. And he was very close friends with Will Counts, the photographer who took some dynamic pictures on the streets of Little Rock. It was apparent, it was just as clear as it could be back in New York to the New York Times that they had missed the story. They had blown it. And they had an opportunity to change it. Mr. Popham, Johnny Popham, got hired by the Chattanooga paper to become their editor, I believe it was. And so they began searching for a reporter to replace him. And they looked, they didn't have to look far. The man who they were looking for was on the copy desk of the New York Times. I'm going to read to you here just a little bit. As Catledge, Turner Catledge, the managing editor, the top editor, looked around the Times newsroom, he didn't see such a person on his reporting staff, but he wasn't alarmed. 6 months earlier, the newspaper had hired a 32-year-old Georgia-born reporter, Claude Sitting, whom Catledge had immediately seen as a strong possibility to go south for the Times. But Sitting hadn't been given a reporting position on the Times. He'd been put on the copy desk, where headlines were written, inconsistencies caught, bad punctuation and spellings fixed, every man's name got a Mr. thrown in front of it, and adverbial life was squeezed out of stories as they were molded to meet the strictures of Times style in the late 1950s. It was rare for anyone to jump from a copy desk to a reporting assignment at the Times, but Catledge was ready to consider it. He dispatched his top assistant to check some references on Sitting and to invite Sitting in for a talk. Claude Fox Sitting was a bona fide son of the South. His genetic lines linked him with the region's historic fidelity to the military, the church, railroads, farming, segregated education, bluegrass music, and assorted lost causes. All useful attributes for a card-carrying member of the New York Times staff. But what was he like? Did he have the right sensibilities and toughness under pressure and under fire? Would he try to cover the South or change it? Would he write from his notebook or from a soapbox? Was he really a reporter after all? His resume showed he'd been a solid wire service reporter for years in several southern cities, but then he'd quit journalism to go to Ghana as a press attaché for the United States Information Agency. What good would that do him in Bogalusa? Could he move swiftly in the South without startling anyone? Could he find a permanent parking space, maybe even a burial bayou, for Popham's Buick, and avail himself of the modern convenience and speed of air travel? Could he work sources, file daily stories, bang out 1,200 words for the Week in Review section, and develop an off-speed pitch that would enable him to write effectively in longer form for the Sunday magazine all at the same time? Was he serious about his work? Was he fearless? The genealogy was fine. His father's family had come from the far northwest reaches of South Carolina, where his great-grandfather had served the Confederacy by being a tax collector. The religion came from his mother's side. Her father had been a minister in the North Georgia Conference, a Methodist church, one of the last of the circuit-riding ministers in the Appalachian foothills of North Georgia. In Georgia, families divided into two camps, for and against Gene Talmadge, the theatrical demagogue whose trademark red suspenders and fiery oratory enthralled the state across 3 decades. The Sitting family was decidedly anti-Talmadge, partly because one of Claude's aunts had gone to school with Talmadge long before and just hadn't thought he was upstanding. The Sittings were also decidedly against race baiting. Sitting had never heard either of his parents utter the word nigger. He had grown up reading the Atlanta Journal, which introduced him to a parade of unusual characters leading the South in the middle of the 20th century. The stories made him curious about the political oddballs who were running the show, so much that he had begun skipping school in the 9th grade and hitchhiking to Atlanta to watch the Georgia legislature in session. He went to Emory, and at Emory he fell into some critical influences. Floyd at the journalism department, and a political science professor. So Turner Catledge examined the resume and decided that Sitting was his man. And he sent him south in 1958 to cover the second phase of the Little Rock story at Central High. I want to just pause here for a minute, if I might, and introduce Claude Sitting. Claude is here with Eva, his wife. This is a brief aside. Back in 1964, Newsweek magazine did a story about the reporters who were covering the South. At that point, Claude had been covering it for 6 years. And unanimously, every reporter who was interviewed in the story said, hands down, the best reporter covering the South is Claude Sitting. And the title of that story in Newsweek was called The Race Beat. And that, in large part, is what led to, it was the first time I think I saw that as someone I'll introduce in a minute will probably recall when Newsweek correspondents would send their dispatches to New York, they were frequently called race stories in the slug, what we call in the newsroom, the title of stories in their files. I want to do a little bit of a reading here that will allow me to do another introduction. Let me just try this. This is Little Rock the second time around. The second time around, Little Rock would be watched by different eyes. NBC's John Chancellor called Harry Ashmore, who was the editor of the Arkansas Gazette, to say he had been given a foreign posting and also was being replaced. When Ashmore asked the name of his replacement, Chancellor knew the name would mean nothing to Ashmore. So he heaped praise on his successor, telling Ashmore the fellow was a terrific former United Press and New York Times reporter. His name was Sander Van Oker. Ashmore pondered the news and the discordant sound of the name, then put Chancellor at ease with the same sense of humor that endeared him to so many reporters. "That's not a name," he said. "That's a typographical error." Just as Popham was bringing Claude Sitting to Little Rock for introductions, Chancellor was bringing Van Oker to town. And it was at this point that you begin to see the formation of the reporters, the white reporters in particular, who were coming into Little Rock and were forming the cadre of reporters who would cover the story from city to city, from town to town. Van Oker also became devoted to Claude Sitting and freely traded information with him. Sitting helped Van Oker peel back Southern nuances and interpret Southern culture. Van Oker couldn't imagine how Sitting knew so much. The day the Arkansas legislature finished its special session, giving Faubus all the segregationist tools he wanted, Van Oker and Sitting left the Sam Peck Hotel, rounded a corner, and were walking past a bank that featured a clock that played music. "You know what they're playing?" Sitting asked. Van Oker didn't have the foggiest idea. "What?" "Where he leads me, I will follow," Sitting said. And Van Oker was astonished how much Claude Sitting knew about Southern culture. CBS News' Harry Reasoner, who, like Sitting, had had a previous life with the USIA, never let Sitting stray too far either, for fear of losing the story. Bill Emerson, Newsweek's bureau chief in Atlanta, settled into Little Rock for the duration, joined by a colleague, Joe Cumming. The magazine went to some lengths to tell its readers that Emerson was from North Carolina, Cumming from Georgia. They, too, ran with Sitting, who also established working relationships with correspondents for Time magazine. Now, before I go further, I want to introduce Mr. Joe Cumming, Newsweek magazine. And he's here with his wife, Emily. It's good to have you. And I don't think Bill Emerson made it. Yes, okay. Bill, we weren't sure if he would, but if you get a chance to meet Bill Emerson, he's a great raconteur. Let me just read one little passage here, and this is still in Little Rock. Excuse me. It was a fresh but keenly professional group of reporters for the most part. They wore coats and ties every day. Criticism of Fine, Shackney, and others in their ranks a year earlier had helped reestablish proper frontline behavior. Van Oker felt as though he were at the center of the world's attention. Reasoner thought that no future story could give him the satisfaction he got covering Little Rock. Among the reporters was a foreign contingent that lent some spice to the lives of the reporters and a sense of heft to the story. Because of the shortage of hotel rooms, and I don't know if you even knew I knew this or how I found this, Joe. Joe Cumming was forced to share lodgings with Neville Maxwell of the Times of London. One day, as Cumming was leaving the room, Maxwell was at the typewriter struggling to describe the attitude exhibited by the governor at a press conference. He finally hit on the proper literary analogy, but he couldn't remember the precise words. He turned to Cumming and asked, and I can't do the British accent, if you're going downtown, would you be good enough to pop into the bookstore and check a quote from Henry V? When? before the Battle of Agincourt. Henry saw where the French had slaughtered the boys, and he made a speech to the effect, "Not since I left England was I angry ere this morning." Cumming felt certain no American reporter would have asked such a favor. Some reporters, particularly those to whom the South was unknown, found the leading characters, even the villains, curious, enigmatic, and occasionally endearing. At one of Faubus's, Governor Faubus, Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, at one of Faubus's many press conferences, Reasoner pressed the governor with a line of questioning that agitated him. The governor struck back with some barbs. When the conference was over and the camera lights were off, Faubus sidled over to Reasoner, threw his arm over the newsman's shoulders, and said, "Sorry as hell to have to do that to you, Harry, but you know how it is." I've been tempted to stop reading right now and to... I'm going to read one other thing, because here's the thing. So many of the reporters who covered the South, and 3 of them are here, were Southerners. It was the Northern press that made a difference, but so many of their representatives were Southern reporters. And many of them have been raised with the moonlight and the magnolias in their eyes, and with segregationist families and segregationist beliefs. And if you look back at even what were considered to be the liberal lights at the time, the Harding Carters, the Ralph McGills, and you look at some of their early writing, you would not be impressed that they were showing great signs of what they later would become. They too could not believe that segregation could ever fall away. And they would even make comments that they thought separation was going to be best. So there was a real evolution, and the race beat talks about that evolution, but there was pressure on them. And here's one thing I want to talk about. This is at Ole Miss, and it's just a couple of 3 paragraphs. Ole Miss would be another battleground for the news weeklies as well. Bill Emerson had left as Atlanta bureau chief, but not before bringing in the reporters Joe Cumming and Frank Trippett, the former from Georgia, the latter from Mississippi, both educated in the South. They were making their mark, but in ways some Southern readers didn't like. The circuit court clerk of Autauga County, Alabama, so disliked Newsweek's coverage that he joined many others in writing the magazine's offices in New York and canceling his subscription to your alleged news medium. A reader in Raymondville, Texas, infuriated by a Cummings story about the growing violence against Negroes, wrote, "Sooner or later, and sooner than you think, the American people will have a bath in their own blood because of a press that is communistic." Jay, you get mail like that, don't you? Even today. Okay. The reader, no doubt thinking Cumming was a wild-eyed Yankee, added a postscript. "My people came to America in 1620. When did yours come?" Cummings' family was as deeply rooted in Augusta, Georgia, as Fleming's family, this is another reporter, his family was unrooted. And Joe found a mistake in the book, so I'm going to correct it right here. Joe's great-great-grandfather, I think I missed a great, and namesake, Joseph B. Cumming, had been the mayor of Augusta with the solemn responsibility on October 15th, 1870, of delivering the city's eulogy to, quote, "the greatest man of his time," close quote, General Robert E. Lee. Cummings' father, also Joseph B. Cumming, headed a prominent Augusta law firm that bore the family name. Young Joe was imbued with all things Southern, graduating from the venerable University of the South in Sewanee. Before being a Newsweek writer might not have been the family's expectation for Joe, and covering civil rights might not have been its wish. But father praised son for the recognition he was getting from the Newsweek brass for his fine work. At the same time, Cummings' father was an affectionate critic of Newsweek's treatment of the South, drawing young Joe's attention to places, quote, "where it is obvious that the writer's orientation was not that of a Southerner," close quote, He bridled at the frequent use of the phrases, the law of the land. In the phrase, in one sense, it probably is an accurate expression, Mr. Cumming wrote his son. On the other hand, it is certainly provocative. It's vague and has merit mainly in its rather sensational phrasing with well-balanced alliterative qualities. Joe is a master of alliteration, I might add. So a whole lot of the book deals with the Southern reporters who, against every expectation of their upbringing, broke free of their own bonds and found themselves evolving, and the sense of fair play that Murdahl had spoken about, and the sense of justice that he had said all Americans at their heart had, emerged first in the reporters who were on the front lines and who were seeing this, and who then told the stories, not in editorials, in straight-up news stories that played on the pages of the major publications of this country. And all they had to do, the most powerful words that were written, were people like Claude in a church down in South Georgia, just describing what it was like to see the sheriff coming in and just blatantly intimidating everybody in the church, the black church, doing everything he could to frighten them and to scare them. And all he had to do was let it walk right into his notebook. No discredit to him that I'm not saying it wasn't hard work. He risked his own life there, but he just reported what he saw, and it goes on the front pages of the New York Times. And just as Murdahl had predicted, Americans were shocked and shaken by what they saw. And that is what led to so much of the change. So that is the end of my talk. And I will take questions, and I'm going to ask these gentlemen maybe to also offer answers if appropriate. So thank you for that. Somebody throw me a tough one. Any question?
Let me offer a comment.
Please.
I just want to say about the book. This is the first serious effort to really look at what reporting about the civil rights movement is like. And what makes it so, is the coverage of the whites who worked with me, is what they did, what they wrote about the blacks. My old friends, Jimmy Hicks, Larry Little, all those folks, what they had done. And that's been missing up until now. And I really urge you to get the book and read it. It's worthwhile.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm proud of that. Gene Roberts, the co-author, just a phenomenal journalist. In the 80s, the greatest editor in America. He was determined that we would, for the first time, tell the story of how the black press covered the movement. And believe me, whatever risk, and it was great risk, Claude and Joe faced was nothing compared to what an L. Alex Wilson faced in Little Rock. Got beat up so bad. What a gentleman. He was the editor of the Tri-State Defender, very tall, dignified man, always kept his coat buttoned, even when he was getting kicked and beaten by a man holding bricks in Little Rock, fell to the ground, kept his coat buttoned, got up, creased his hat again, put it back on. Ralph's friend, Will Counts, caught the images. And then L. Alex Wilson, who had covered the Korean conflict, who had won the Wendell Willkie Award, which is basically for black journalists at the time, and maybe still was the Pulitzer for journalism, for black journalists. He is beaten up so badly that it affects him for the rest of his life. Sadly, he didn't have many more years. He reached the pinnacle of black journalism. He became the editor of the Chicago Defender. He's beat up in 1957. He dies 3 years later as editor of the Chicago Defender at age 51 from this assault. So we are very proud. I'm glad you pointed that out. Other questions? Yes. Ralph.
Yes.
This is Ralph McGill, the third.
Yes. I just wanted to ask what you think about
Good question about the publishers. How much? What do I think about the publishers being willing to lose as much money as they did? I guess you're asking also to what extent was there some courage shown there, and what references does it have to today? Let me talk about the past more than the present. Not that I don't think publishers today show a great deal of courage. If you think about this, coming out of World War II, frankly, when you get to the 1950s, if you're a publisher in the South, and pretend here that I know what I'm talking about when there are people here who know better than I, but my research would tell me that when you're a publisher in the South coming out of World War II, really all you care about is the South going to get its fair share? Is it going to grow? Is it going to industrialize? Will it return? Can it become an economic power? Can it make the transition from agriculture to industrialization? Will it ever reach the 20th century as far as creating an economy that works? And the last thing you want is to have a civil war again. And you don't want it, and civil war means a civil rights war, and you will do anything to avoid it. And to some extent, what you will do is ignore it if you have to. So there were a large number of publishers throughout the South who were loving their new prosperity. There's a great passage from William Allen White. I'm just going to read you real fast here that's relevant to this. He says he was talking about. He's talking about editors, publishers, and editors, because so many publishers at this point did not have newspaper backgrounds. I mean, by comparison to today, they did. They were much friendlier to the business interests in town than they had been before the war. This is William Allen White. This is a publisher he's talking about. He is a rich man seeking power and prestige. He has the country club complex. The business manager of this absentee owner quickly is afflicted with the country club point of view. Soon the managing editor's wife nags him into it, and they all get into the unconscious arrogance of conscious wealth. Therefore, it is hard to get an American newspaper to go the distance to print all the news about many topics. So those publishers who were able to overcome that tendency just to protect what you got took a lot of courage. In some cases, they had to own the papers. Hottie Carter owned his own paper over there. Mr. McGill worked at the time for, when you worked for the Coxes, by the time this all came about, they had their own very forthright, forward-thinking attitudes about race, too. There might have been differences within the newsroom as to how much latitude they were going to give them. But by and large, that's why, to a large extent, it was going to take the northern press to come in. Because their publishers were not as worried about protecting the economic interests of the South. By comparison to today, I don't know. I know I, for one, feel like I work for a very bold and courageous publisher who's willing to take on the business interests of this town when it's in the interests of exposing secrecy in government. I think that the work that he did on forcing the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce to turn over records about net funding for the NASCAR Hall of Fame was an act of courage. They're still out there in places. Yes?
I thank you for your eloquent depiction of the events that occurred at that time, and I'm so appreciative of you all coming tonight to share with us your involvement with that. And you speak about the media being a lever of change and the northern press. I heard earlier this week Cheryl Brown Henderson, the daughter of Reverend Brown of Brown versus Topeka, speaking about the media as a lever of negative change and influence in Brown versus Topeka, manipulating the myth of Brown versus Topeka in terms of what was happening with that particular case. Are there other incidents where the media served a negative influence and the northern press served as a negative influence on civil rights?
The answer is yes. I can address mostly the Southern press and the influence that it had, a very negative influence that it had. Yes, I mean, going through the archives, and so much of this is based on the archives of editors, and but going through the archives of segregationist editors, sure, it's a little surprising to see editors from Syracuse and, Binghamton, I'm making these names, but throughout the country, giving them attaboys for their segregationist points of view. So there were certainly people across the country, editors who weren't not themselves facing race relations issues in their own towns, who were encouraging the segregationist editors down here. But the hostility that Joe and that Claude faced from the segregationist press in the South, and I think probably Ralph experienced that a little bit even in Little Rock, was pretty amazing. The segregationist press did not want this story told. And these guys were working at odds with them. And they would face editorial comments excoriating them. And the reporters who worked for the segregationist press were some of the most vile people you can imagine. Some of their comments were just beyond belief, the things that they would say in their columns. And they made it very difficult for these guys to do their work. Would you all like to comment?
You got very great insights in the book about especially two people who were of that stripe. One was James Jackson, who killed Patrick, the Richmond News leader, who proposed, advocated the business of secession again under a different title. That's what it was. Then you had Tom Waring over at the Charleston News and Courier, who was just as bad.
Yeah.
Yeah. Grover Cleveland Hall in Montgomery, but you might put him less militant than the others, because he went to a black mass meeting where they talked about civil rights. And he walked out and saw the quote I didn't hear him say it. He said, well, you'll have to admit, he was Rose on the party, he said, you'll have to admit they got all the cliches of Western man on their side.
The one good thing that I can say about the segregationist editors, I'm sure there are many good things. Some of them were not bad people, the editors, okay? Some of them were decent people. You could meet them, you'd never know, okay? But one thing that I really, really appreciate about them is they believed that they were at an important point in history, and they saved every piece of paper that ever crossed their desk. And so the archives are replete with this, Yes?
Recurrent question. There were also sins of omission with the press, ignoring some good stories, some positive stories that I think would maybe have alleviated some problems. There were few enough of them in the South, but they should not have been overlooked.
And I would say, actually, that was the story that Johnny Popham wanted to cover. He said, let me cover the good things that are going on in race relations, and there were. I mean, by the time Little Rock blew up, the fact is that institutions of higher education in most of the states in the South had already integrated to some extent, or an institution in there. It may not be the major state institution, but integration had been moving forward. But the fact is that by the time the Brown versus Board decision came in 1954, striking down school segregation, the die was cast, the lines were drawn. Can I come up with another cliche? It was the story of the conflict was going to prevail, and there was just no turning that around. So let me see. George, would you just stand up and say that George won the Pulitzer Prize in 1948 for exposing vote fraud in Telfair, Georgia. Sorry for interrupting. Go ahead.
The predictions that Adam
The question is management of the news. I mean, your first point about the Atlanta papers and the editorial voices were enormously strong. Ralph McGill and Gene Patterson stood for what was right and did it every single day. I mean, honestly, if you try to get a columnist today to write 3 times a week, that's asking an awful lot. They wrote 7 days a week, both of them. Ralph McGill put himself out there on page 1 every day. And they were voices of sanity, and they were voices of progressiveness. And by the way, they were liberal by the measure of the times. They weren't outrageous. They weren't radical. But Ralph McGill, by the time of the Supreme Court decision in 1954, all he said at that point was, we need to progress in our race relations, and we need to, just because it's the law of the land. The Supreme Court has spoken, and if you violate that, if you try to stop school desegregation or whatever desegregation or whatever public facility, you're violating the law of the land. So that's where he hung his hat, was just on the law. Over time, the true humanist in him came out, and it evolved into more of a broader declaration that you do it because it's the right thing to do. And you do it because it's a societal imperative that black people and white people live together, try to get along together, and build a society together. There are economic reasons, there are social reasons, there are humane reasons. And so you see Ralph McGill in full bloom, and the evolution of him in full bloom. There were absolutely newspapers that kept it off the front pages. You can go into Birmingham, and you don't even have to. You can go into their archives, and you can look at the Birmingham News and the Birmingham Post-Herald for the entire spring of 1963, when the dogs and the hoses are being unleashed, and you will not find a single photograph of a dog or somebody holding a fire hose. So, the Birmingham papers decided it was their civic responsibility to put a lid on it. And they would say, we weren't racist. This wasn't about that. We were just civic-minded. And we weren't going to give the segregationists a page 1 either. Well, in fact, they did. But so, you're right. There was news management back then of that nature. Yes, sir.
I'm interested in any encounter you are Mr. Sitting or Mr. Commodore Ralph have had with Daisy Bates, who along with her husband ran the Arkansas State Press Bureau.
Ralph?
Could you repeat the question?
Yes, I'm sorry. The question was any encounters we had or anything we can say regarding Daisy Bates. I'll tell you who she was first. Daisy Bates was the wife of the publisher and therefore very, very actively involved in publishing the Arkansas State Press, the weekly black newspaper in Little Rock. She was also head of the NAACP and the chief, surrogate mother and guide of the 9 students who desegregated Central High. And Ralph was in Little Rock at the time.
I didn't have any personal relationship with her until a number of years after that. I became the city editor. She was still very active. I did have a personal relationship with Ernie Green, who was going to blow up High, the first black graduate of Little Rock Central High School. He and I worked together at a shoe store when we were both in high school. He was a great tennis player.
Yes.
Franklin Ray was Stevens at Little Rock. The black students who desegregated Central High met at her home, and she counseled them before they went out to those schools.
That's also where several of the black reporters had to stay at that house. You couldn't get a hotel there. Yes?
Just jumping on what he was saying, can you talk a little bit about women reporters who were involved or the editors that were involved?
The question is about women reporters and women editors who are involved. That won't take long to answer. I don't say that proudly. It's they're certainly one that comes to everyone's mind would be Hazel Brannon Smith, the editor of the Lexington Advertiser in Holmes County, Mississippi. Again, by modern standards, by today's standards, hardly a liberal. She was just thought that you don't go around beating people up just because they're of their color, or just and that a policeman can't sort of just because a black guy owns the feed store, is back on it, he's behind on his payment, that the feed store operator isn't allowed to go up and just sort of take a club and beat the guy, and that she would write strong editorials against such misbehavior and that sort of thing. Not that there were not women of great courage, even before then, and African American women in particular, even before then, but not so much and I don't want to say none, but not as much in the South. In Washington, Allison Donegan, certainly in 1947, desegregated the Capitol Press Corps, the Washington Press Corps there, the first woman. And also in 47 was the first time a man got into the National Press Club. Maybe that was 55. I think it was pretty late. But you won't find too many women at the time who were in the main core of the press. So, other questions? Yes?
You talked about the importance of the journalistic distance and how that was critical to telling the story. And I was wondering if any of these gentlemen could comment on it. When you were watching these events unfold and these terrible things happen, how you went about keeping that distance and not finding yourself involved.
The question was, I was talking about how the objective reporting that one would do might even have the impact of an editorial, because it could be such a strong rendering of what happened. But she was asking, how do reporters detach themselves from what they were seeing to write objectively and to not get caught up in it and to not fundamentally just write editorials? Is that correct? Yeah.
Well, what I did in the night after the bus ride in Birmingham beating, and he came to Montgomery, and that night I stationed myself when Martin Luther King was in the church. I stationed myself in one of those little bell towers right out front, and that's where the marshals were with tear gas, and the mob was with great big 2x4s, and they threw and so I was safe. See, I had them right up there, and I took notes on everything. They went and they threw the tear gas, and they dispersed, and turned over a car, which I could see, and set it on fire. So, but that was a special thing. I just somehow decided that instead of hearing King make his talk, he called the president, called Washington that night. I think that's when they were on. And I just somehow lucked out and sitting up in this little tower. You know how church has these little towers in the front, and I just positioned myself there, and I got a real good piece of action there. So that was just one thing.
If I might, there's one scene in the book. Claude would go out and all across the South. He'd be gone for weeks. In fact, when Eva she probably doesn't remember, she was interviewed by Newsweek for that story in 1964 about the press is covering it. And so they said, well, your husband's on the road all the time. I mean, what's that like? She said, well, it sure saves on the cleaning. But Claude would go out on the road, he'd come back, and I guess the New York Times offices were at the Journal-Constitution offices. I don't know, but McGill would come to his door and pick his brain on what he'd seen when he was out there. And before Claude had a chance to write his story, McGill would write his column on Claude's findings. So that Claude would then write about it for the New York Times, always worried that he would be suspect of having ripped off McGill when it was the other way around. But to your point, I want to say this, one little quick read here. There was about this is sort of McGill's concern, Ralph McGill's concern about that the reporting was in danger of becoming mindless, robotic sort of become victim of the cult of objectivity. Certainly, reporters had to be fair, McGill felt, but he did not see the point of purely objective news presentations if that meant the truth got lost in the process. Objectivity, he believed, was an anachronistic antidote that had emerged in earlier days when publishers had been wild and reckless in pushing their biases into newspapers. It had evolved into a formula of printing all sides of the story, sometimes in the same number of words or paragraphs, and leaving readers to make their own choices. From there, McGill felt, the goal of objectivity had devolved to the point where newspapers had become neutered. If a public figure said something that was untrue or mischaracterized the situation, McGill felt, most newspapers wouldn't report the falsity unless the reporter could get someone else to point it out. And if that someone else stretched the truth, McGill said, newspapers devoted to blind objectivity found themselves in a bind, printing two falsities. So you had a situation where if the White Citizens Council publishes an ad in the Yazoo City Herald listing all the African Americans who had registered to vote so that their employers would fire them, and then you go to the Citizens Council and says, what are you doing? They say, we had nothing to do with it, or we're just serving the public information flow here. We're not trying to get them fired. It's in the Yazoo City Herald. The Yazoo City Herald reporter could have gone over there and found who paid for the ad and found out that it was the Citizens Council, and certainly could have reported the intent was clearly to get these people fired from their jobs. But newspapers wouldn't touch that, many of them, in order to preserve what they thought of as the peace. But I'm going to tell you that overall, you look at the reporting these guys did, and it's hugely impressive for how it doesn't inject their own personality and their own opinions into it. And they didn't have to in many cases. It was powerful without it.
You mentioned Frank Trickett
yeah.
of Time magazine earlier. Frank Trickett was from northwestern Mississippi. So he went home for Christmas one day with the height of the crisis. And an uncle of Frank said, "Frank, what you doing down here? You going to tell a bunch of lies on us?" And Frank said, "No, I'm going to do worse than that. I'm going to tell the truth."
Yes, Bob.
I just want to ask one last question. What is your support, and is there still support for Morris Deeds?
What is my support for Morris Deeds? I don't even know him. I know who he is. I've never met him. Don't know him. Yes, Joseph.
I noticed your book has a chapter entitled Wallace and King. I have a question, I guess. If you can't ask it, maybe some of the other reporters can ask it. During this struggle of civil rights, those are two central figures. And is it anything in the book that talks about, did they have dialogue amongst each other in an attempt to try to avoid some of the violence that occurred in this era?
Did Wallace and King have any dialogue in order to try to avert the crisis? No, not that I know of. I don't know that there was ever a time where they... I know of a book, a fictionized account of things in which they crossed paths in a South Alabama town, but I don't believe they would have. So, yes, Jan?
I'm struck by the fact that you're a son of Alabama, a reporter who spent a lot of years up north, and a man who's come back to be at the helm of the largest newspaper in the South, and the fact that this book has finally come full circle, and I wonder about what that's like for you emotionally.
You always ask those questions. Jan is editor of our great narrative writing, and she instructs her reporters to always ask these sorts of questions of people. And when she walked in, I should have seen it coming,
Would you repeat?
The question was, what do I, as a son of the South, how do I feel about having been away and come back and having been working on this book for a long time, what do I feel? First of all, I feel first and foremost great gratitude to Gene Roberts, who got me into this. And he is the son of the South, and he lives and breathes this story every minute. And this was his dream, to get this book done. And to me, there's no greater fulfillment than for him. But I will say that as a 14-year-old in Alabama, I had a paper route. And I was in North Alabama. And North Alabama was very different from South Alabama. We were more industrialized. I lived in Florence, with the Eric Muscle Shoals area, with the heart of Tennessee Valley Authority, which was this great ongoing, socialism in America. And we always thought we were different from other parts of Alabama. North Alabama didn't even vote for Governor Wallace until the last time he ran. I think even my own parents voted for him then, because the guy I was running against was carrying a gun with him everywhere he went. Anyway, when I'm 14 and I'm in North Alabama and I'm delivering the Birmingham News, the afternoon paper, and it was quite clear what's going on in 1963. This is in 1963 in Birmingham. You can turn on television. It's all over with the television with the dogs and the hoses. It's this great catalytic moment in American history. It was in my own hometown newspaper in Florence, edited by a wonderful man, Louis Eckel, who is in the book, and I just a great man. Some of you may know his son here. He's a lawyer, Ray Eckel. It was all over the Florence paper, my hometown paper. But it was not in the paper I'm delivering. And, you just sit there and the paper's on your lap and you roll them up and you put the rubber band around them. Don't look at me like I'm an old man, Robbie. Come on, And then you put them in the basket. But there was nothing in there about what's going on in Birmingham on the front page of the paper. And then you run into September of 63, how many months later from May? I can't do the math. And that church bombing takes place, the 16th Street Baptist Church. And these girls are my age. Three of them are 14, one of them is 11. And it's hard to remember what one felt, but one can remember that they felt. And I wasn't in fear. I didn't have any fear. What do I have to fear? So having left the South, for college, I went back south, Mississippi, and did some reporting and got to meet a lot of these guys before they passed on, and was honored to be able to meet them. Moved north to Boston, to Philadelphia. Came back here, and I will have to tell you that it was only after I got back here that I realized that I had all this knowledge that for many years in Philadelphia, but for the fact that I was working for some Southerners like Gene Roberts and Gene Foreman and so forth, but for that fact, all this knowledge had nowhere to go up there. And suddenly I get back down here and I remember the story all over again. And so I felt like suddenly there's a use for my knowledge. And a lot of it is in here. It's Gene's book, but I have some knowledge in it. Yes?
Could you speak a little bit about the Black Press in Atlanta?
Well, I talk about the Black Press in Atlanta. I can talk a little bit about it. They're probably greater experts than me. The Atlanta Daily World was distinguished as the only, until the Chicago Defender went daily, was the only daily black newspaper in the country. And a powerful force. And the Scott family that owned it came out of a deep, rich tradition. It's even today, it is sometimes hard for people to recall that African Americans in the South were enormously loyal to the Republican Party. Who signed the Emancipation Proclamation? This was the party of Lincoln. And they were deeply loyal. As that broke away, as more of them parted with that during FDR, and then during the 60 campaign that Taylor Branch has detailed so powerfully the moment when the Kennedys call Coretta Scott King, when Martin Luther King is in the Reedsville jail, and all of a sudden overnight, it's sort of electric throughout the South. The word gets out, vote for Kennedy. But the Scott family that owned the Atlanta Daily World did not part from their Republican loyalties. They owned papers here, Birmingham, and Memphis. We focus in the book on Birmingham, the Birmingham World. Emory Overton Jackson, a guy out of, I think in Georgia we call it Buena Vista, not Buena, Buena Vista, Georgia, went to Morehouse College, single-minded newspaper man, hardworking, would forget to even go home and change clothes. He would just fall asleep in his office and wake up the next day and start working again. He also served as on the NAACP board and was on the Montgomery Improvement Association. Had a lot of, and clearly was a Democrat. And he bridled at what he believed to be the pressure from the Scott family not to be as endorsing of the bus boycott, of passive resistance, of King in general. And it's well documented, the split between the Scott family here and the King family. Again, there are people who know more about that than I do. But that was always sort of an interesting dynamic and point of contention in the black press in the South.
Hank, we really are out of time. We let you go longer because you wanted to go till Friday, tomorrow. So if there's one more important question, why don't we do that? And then he'll be signing up here, and we would like to invite Mr. Cumming and Mr. Sitting to also sit at the autograph table.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes.
I had the opportunity to be assigned to stories and spent a lot of time to do. And one of the things that struck us, how vital sources are, of course, to a journalist, was the difference in conduct between editors and assignment desk editors, too. In larger cities with larger papers, and the very small towns that had small papers and small radio stations, those editors were willing to talk to outside press, but they would never print what they discussed. I'm wondering if you covered any of that kind of aspect in the book.
You said the small town editors would be willing to talk to the incoming press from the north or wherever. Yeah. I don't know. These fellows may know. Were you more welcomed by some of the editors in some of the smaller towns than? Is there any pattern there that you saw? I guess it depended from town to town. Certainly, that would not be the majority, is my guess. You get into Jackson, Mississippi, which is not a small town. The papers there were owned by the Hederman family. Not only were they the most segregationist editors in America, they were the worst editors in America, and they put together the worst newspaper in America. And you have a situation during the Ole Miss crisis when their city editor would spend all day helping put out the newspaper and writing all these with his name, byline, city editor, writing these glowing stories about the governor, Ross Barnett. And when he got off work, he'd walk right up to the couple of blocks to either the governor's mansion or the state capitol and sit there and plan strategy with the governor on how they were going to continue this resistance. And in fact, it got so close that the coziness between the governor and the Clarion Ledger and that particular editor, that when Ross Barnett got rid of the state college board and the registrar, he was prepared to name Gene Worth, the city editor of the Clarion Ledger, to be registrar because he knew he'd do whatever he wanted, and it would have happened but for the fact that on the day he was going to announce it, Gene Worth died of a heart attack. It was just this phenomenal coincidence. Thank you all very much. I appreciate it.